Hello, everybody. Welcome. Let's take a moment to ground ourselves before we jump into a lecture on psychodynamic theory. So when you're ready, just take a moment to notice where your tailbone is in your seat. Maybe shift it forward or back. And allow yourself to notice your belly. If you're holding anything in, see if you can soften it. And then maybe bring your shoulders way up to your ears and set them back down, just feeling really relaxed and settled. Take a moment just to notice your thoughts. Notice if they're going really fast or if they're really slow and groggy. Notice if there's a lot to do or nothing to do. And then see if you can notice your emotions. Maybe there's excitement, or maybe there's a little bit of stress or tension. And seeing if you can set that all aside for the next hour and see if you can bring an open heart, an open mind. And with that, we'll take a bow. Okay, let's jump in. So in just a moment, I'm going to do a screen share. And while I'm pulling that up, I'll invite you to make sure you have a notebook, a pen and paper, a cup of tea, maybe a glass of water, anything that's going to make your learning environment really smooth and sweet. So let's all just take a moment to orient ourselves, grab your supplies, and we'll jump in just a sec. Welcome to class number 2. This is a lecture on psychodynamic theory, and we'll be using several textbooks to kind of walk ourselves through this material, one being Human Growth and Development Across the Lifespan, and another one being Nurturing Natures, and this one is by Graham Musics, as well as Albin's book on stress and stress disorders. All right, so as a follow-up to our first class, as I mentioned, we'll open each class with a small activity related to Taoist energy medicine. So today, as part of that introduction, I'd like to work on the aspect of yin and yang, right? Unless maybe you live in Texas and it's yang, yin and yang. So just like we have 5-element theory, which is the 5 elements, I'm going to pause while you think about them. If you can even write them down for a moment, it's going to be water. Water then generates wood. Wood turns into fire. The fire spins the earth. And then the earth houses precious metals and the cycle starts up again. So these are really integral to Chinese medicine as well as Chinese culture, and just ways of being that are really in alignment with season and with nature and with cosmology. So even in alignment with how stars and moon shifts occur. So these references go all the way back to 700 BCE, and you can find that information in the I Ching, a book of changes, which talks about the dynamic balance of opposites and the unfolding of events and day-to-day aspects. So yin and yang are distinctively found within the Chinese system of perception and allow us a more expansive way of looking at the world as well as looking at course material. So as we're moving across a big timeline of what is counseling, what is psychology, what is mind paradigms that emerged in the West, and we're really kind of starting our timeline around the late 1800s into the 19th century, catching ourselves up to the present day. But I want to echo that systems for treating the mind, the spirit, the body have been around in all cultures for hundreds of thousands of years. And so just want to really start with the true origin of noticing the mind from 700 BCE from the I Ching. So as we're looking at this recap on what is yin, what is yang, yang are the things that are known a bit more the 3D material world. It's about order. There can be an association with masculinity, as well as time of day, more authoritarian ways of being, structure. And if we were to put this against a philosophical paradigm, you could potentially say fascism. There's a really right way to do things culturally. And then the yin is going to represent, kind of starting to think things like nighttime, the front side of the body versus the back side of the body, like yang. It represents chaos. Yin is chaos, as well as that femininity, which is more of the receptive energy, nighttime. And when we're looking at ways of being, it can be decadence, right? Like yin in the body is associated with fat. So adipose, and fat is quite a gift, culturally speaking, right? Because if you're able to have extra fat, there's often, not always, but access to extra resources, abundance of food. That's very Jupiterian, or very big and full. And so the philosophy, if we were to socially map yin and yang, might be nihilism. Like, what does it all mean? So I invite you to just take a moment and write down some things within mindfulness or even therapy that could be yin or more yang. And of course, it's a gradient, and we'll talk about that gradient in just a moment. But for now, thinking paradigms perhaps where there's a lot more activity. So somatic work or dance therapy is going to be very young compared potentially to EMDR, where you have the person sitting down, reliving memory through desensitization. That would be quite chaotic and not as much movement, very yin. So just as we're thinking about psychotherapy in the West, how does this meet Eastern philosophy, and how do we hold this worldview in a more flexible way? So curious to hear about your list of what healing paradigms and counseling could be yin, could be yang. So up next, I also want to mention opposition, mutual consumption, interdependence, and transformation. So let's just take a moment to stop and think about these 4 attributes and what one each could mean. So we know for opposition, there are going to be 2 sides to a condition as it relates to health. So instead of having a disease state and one being in opposition of the disease, perhaps both are there. So it's this idea that there's always going to be a polarity within yin and yang, right? The white aspect, yang, and the black, they're different. They're going to bring up different echoes for each other. And the mutual consumption is the idea that when we've been too active, right? Like, let's say you stayed up all night and went to a concert. Then the next day you're going to sleep, which pulls in more yin. So if you're really, really hyperactive, then your body is going to need a lot of time of rest. If you've been resting a lot, you might be like, oh, I really want to get out and move. So just in the same way that it's the darkest moment of the night sky just before the sun rises. So yin and yang are always going to be consuming each other. And that's that mutual consumption is yin needs yang and yang needs yin. The other aspect is that they're interdependent, and interdependency is the idea that they can't exist without the other. So we can't have the sun without the moon to have existence on this planet, right? We'd need both. Imagine if it was sunny and you had to sleep, right? Like if you lived in Alaska or something and it was only a little bit of yin time, like 3 hours a night, depending on the movements of the planets and the sun. It's like, oh my gosh, you would be up. So there's this idea that these two things need each other to exist. And then transformation is the notion that they always turn into the other. So in any framework or modality we have, there's going to be opposition to one framework that came before. There's going to be a mutual consumption of them turning into the other. There's still going to be interdependence. So as we talk about psychodynamic theory as an umbrella, within that umbrella, there's still interdependent components that exist within it. And then, of course, yin yang is the transformation. I also want to bring your awareness to this graphic up here that we're looking at. So as you see this Tai Chi symbol, you can see that there's light even within the most dark moment of yin. And the same is true as we look at the yang part, which is the white color. There's still a dab of shadow, even in the light. And so I think that's really important to notice of that interdependence piece. They both need each other. And then around this is 64 hexagrams. And these hexagrams that are depicted here in the I Ching each represent a different, if you will, energetic or paradigm shift. So as we're talking about psychology in the West with a lot of Eastern perspectives, we're thinking alongside of this quality of yin and yang moving into each other as we get through theories. So we see behaviorism for a little bit was very yang, and then it created a very yin movement of humanism. So we'll talk about this ebb and flow as we go on. The frame that we're going to use throughout this lecture and as well as throughout this class is really the highest pinnacle. And for me, any graduate class really involves this creative energy because we have to start with the foundation of, can you recall some facts, some basic concepts? Can you walk away from this PowerPoint with 3 new things that you didn't know before and be able to explain them to a colleague, to a patient or a client? And then can you understand, right? Can you see patterns in all of this? Explain more of the complex ideas. But here's the fun part. Can you apply it, right? So what good is it just to walk around with intellectual knowledge if you can't necessarily apply it? So in this class towards the end, we'll do a little case study for you to apply. And then my hope is for you to walk away analyzing your world, starting to see these psychodynamic behaviors and characters in movies or characters in your life, maybe a partner you're dating or a boyfriend or girlfriend, and be like, whoa, I'm analyzing the defense mechanisms that come up for me and the other. Or I'm watching Desperate Housewives and I'm psychoanalyzing the characters. So starting to really analyze and evaluate, and hopefully that happens after the lecture. And then what are you going to create that's new as you assimilate these new constructs, these new thought forms? So are you ready to jump in? I heard a few yeses. I think it's time. Let's take a jump. Okay, so as you know, in the textbook, Beckett and Taylor talk a lot about Freud kind of being, if you will, the godfather to mental health work and to really looking at psychology. So with Freud, some of the things we know is that he was working in the early 1900s and he was trained as a medical doctor. And within that, he was very interested in psychiatry. So he, right, in his training, studied the whole human body and was strongly influenced by current trends that were happening, which at the time were looking at things like, how is human biology a survival link? And different types of evolutionary sciences were forming. And so he's being inspired by, whoa, human biology, whoa, humans are animals. And so how does that animal instinct drive us? So what he did was create these early childhood developmental stages, which we hadn't seen early childhood developmental stages as a piece of psychology yet. And we're looking at, with these developmental stages, how do these early childhood years shape how the ego is formed? And Freud and Carl Jung were not the ones to come up with the term the ego. Is really the late 1800s that it was being used in other philosophical circles. But they started to see, hey, well, how does the ego feed into what we call a personality structure? And then, of course, this really is a deeper look at the biology of stress and sexuality in general. So if you can walk away from this lecture today with three things, my hope is that it will be a good understanding of developmental stages from Erik Erikson as well as Freud, as well as looking at defense mechanisms that the ego can take to protect itself when it feels threatened, and have some flexibility around what is personality structure within psychodynamic theory, starting off at the early years of life. And then maybe we'll walk away with a few interesting facts on just the biology of stress and sexuality. So are you ready to jump in and see if we can't walk away with that kind of base of Bloom's taxonomy? All right, let's jump in. So Freud was born in 1856 in Moriba, which is now known as the Czech Republic. This is all important context, that's why I'm bringing it in. He was the oldest of 8 children, and him and his family went to Vienna, where he spent most of his life. His training, as I mentioned, was as a medical doctor, and so he was assigned a lecture on nervous disease, which is interesting, right? Because now we're talking about the nervous system and how that really can play into things. So that's where he was in 1885. And after spending time looking at different human theories related to psychoanalysis, he started to develop his own work. So some of the key themes that comes from Freud's writing include life and death instincts, psychosexual development, and mechanisms of defense. So he claimed that there are 2 classes of instincts or impulse, and this work was further developed by Mary Klein, and we'll talk a little bit more about Klein's work as we go, but that there's instincts that we are born to survive, and so life instincts includes procreation, survival, and pleasure, and death instincts often include aggression or harm. He also suggested that there are 5 stages of growth in which the human personality evolves, and these evolving aspects of personality are very much related to the oral stage, which is the mouth, and we come into this world, right? Often, many of us being breastfed or taking in food, as well as we'll talk a little bit more about the anal stage, phallic, latent, and genital. So really moving through this arc of how personality develops. Freud also just suggested that people use defense mechanisms to avoid anxiety or nervous disorders. I also want to mention here that Freud in 1886, after working in this nervous disorder clinic, he started using hypnosis in his clinical work. And some of the limitations that people often speak of when they're looking at Freud's work is that he didn't use a large segment of the population, right? He was working with the upper echelons of society, and most of his work was written about a client described as Anna O, where he would invite her to talk about some of her symptoms. And the more she talked about them and was able to process what was happening, the better she felt. And she was able to retrieve traumatic memories by being in a relaxed state, which we now know is, theta or delta brainwave states instead of a more gamma state, which is hyperactive. So when we relax the body, we're able to access memories and then we can process them. So Freud was kind of, in addition to Joseph Breuer, and that's spelled B-R-E-U-R, in the early 1900s, were the first people to really position this idea of like, wow, if we talk and process aspects of our life, healing takes place. But mind you, this was still a very gendered and racialized context in Eastern Europe at the time, right? So you're seeing a lot of males, often who are white. You're seeing often who have money and access to get an education, developing these theories around talk therapy. And so their worldview then becomes very limited, right? Kind of like blinders in the theories they're using because they're using limited populations and their exposure linguistically, geographically is more limited than potentially what it is today. So just wanted to throw out that Freud was big on hypnosis, really founder of talk therapy, as well as free association, which we'll talk more about when we discuss Carl Jung's work. Okay, so this is also exciting times because it's where we're looking at the unconscious mind and really being able to develop a structure around it. And this is also kind of the interface as far as early 1900 writings go, where we're intersecting morality, spirituality into psychological health in the West, right? We look at Buddhism, that's always, the intersect has always been there. But the three key elements that of personality that Freud starts to write about with his clinic, or patients in his clinic, is the id, the ego, and the superego. So the ego becomes a conscious state, right? Thinking more gamma, like you're aware of something. But we also have these unconscious aspects of the id and the superego. And the superego is more of that ethical framework that potentially we have through socialization. So I found this graphic online. And so you can see the id is primarily instincts. The ego can be associated with one's reality of like what truly is. And then the superego can be like a little devil or a little kind of angel compared to the id. So the id is instinctual. The philosophy here is a little dark, just that humans want to promote their own self-preservation and don't really care about others. And so he believed that the superego came in to balance this, which is morality. And so we're going to jump a little bit more into how this intersects with sexuality, because hopefully this is a little bit of a review for you, especially if you have an undergraduate degree in psychology or you've just done some reading. You're kind of like, yes, I'm aware that Freud has psychosexual stages as well as these three personalities. But what's important to know here is that the oral stage typically occurs around 1 year of age, kind of like a puppy. They put everything in their mouth. So they're learning their world through the mouth. And then the anal stage, if we're thinking about it, learning how to control your bladder, learning how to listen to bowel movements, the anal stage is really where we're coming into a somatic awareness. And so this can be from 1 year old to 3. And then the phallic stage is where you realize that the pleasure principle really of, oh my goodness, I have a body, I have pleasure centers throughout related to my genitals. But that still could also include other pleasure centers in the body, such as when you realize you can be tickled in your ribs or your armpits. So this is all kind of part of the genital stage. And then the latency stage is 6 years old of puberty to all the way to an inactive libido. And then the genital stage just becomes when sexual interest matures. So just take a moment, write these stages down. They're also listed in our textbook, but just want to give you a moment to echo these. All right, so hopefully you have those down and then we'll just move on. So the unconscious mind, you can see is layered on often with this metaphor of an iceberg. So it's the idea that when a client comes to you for help, and they articulate, perhaps I felt anxious. That's just the tip of the iceberg of perhaps their awareness of an anxiety. And then our job is to explore more of the theta, the delta brainwave states in this hypnotic way to understand, well, what ego defense mechanisms are just below the surface that are preventing that from happening. And so you can see as we go further down, there's a juxtaposition of the superego, which is what is moral? What is the right thing for me to do? What is my alignment? And the id, which is sometimes I just have these instinctual human drives and behavior. So this would be Freud's view of the mind. And all of the issues come from a hidden human instinct to survive. And most of that is unconscious to us. And we're going to look at some other perspectives of a mind map of what could happen for people that's underneath the surface. So in dream work, Freud was actually the first person to also bring onto the scene dream work. That wasn't there before. And so he used and pulled a lot of these Latin terms to look at how prophecies can be received in a dream, as well as the foretelling of a future event, premonition, and how the symbol for a dream requires interpretation. And these theories have survived for many centuries and are very important. So what we see here is that he believed that dreams were a way to unpack hidden sexual desires. And so those hidden sexual desires really come from the Oedipus complex, which many of us know that infantile sexual trauma can be a general explanation as to why Freud came up with this theory. And he also had a theory of seduction, which stated that if there's unconscious memories of sexual molestation in children, then that can become an obsessional tendency in adulthood. So let's just pause and give Freud a second, right? There's a lot of critiques of Freud, but let's just name that he is bringing hypnosis to the scene. And we know how efficient that is through studies that are currently conducted through the National Institute of Health that show hypnosis is very efficient for trauma. He also brought dream work to medical and scholarly circles of, hey, I think there's latent content from the iceberg that can come up, or we can have an access point through dream work. And so this is also really big to be noticing. However, some of his colleagues at the time see it a little bit different. So Carl Jung is one of those. Carl Jung was a student of Freud, and they had a deep falling out because really of this point on dream work, that Carl Jung thought, no, dreams can conjure up way more important latent content that people are unaware of. And Freud was very upset by this idea. He was like, no, it's really about sexual misconduct and sexual issues. And Carl Jung said, well, it could be about more issues beyond sex. So Carl Jung really took us, above the second chakra of, hey, maybe it's about confidence, or maybe it's about connection, or maybe it's about being seen or not being seen, speaking our truth, not speaking our truth. So this was a big shift. So let's take a moment, and if you'd like, you can draw this map next to Freud's map in your notes. So you have, okay, this is Freud's map of the mind. This is a Jungian map of the mind. So Carl Jung positioned the self in the center. And then the ego is actually what projected to the persona. And the persona simply is how you wish you're seen in the world. So maybe if you're someone who self-identifies as a female in the world, you wear dresses because that's in alignment and you want to be seen that way. Or maybe you want to be seen as a kind person. And so the persona is the mask we put on for the outer world. And then the ego is mediating what the self is, but also the shadow work, right? The things that are hidden to us, the skeletons in the family closet, the skeletons in our personal closet of experiences that are simply undigested, that might have a charge of pain or heavy emotion to them. That's all shadow work. But you can see that Freud expanded this a little. It's not just your personal shadow work, which, if you're someone who likes astrology, you would associate with the eighth house of hidden secrets, debt, sexuality. That's where shadow work is. But Carl Jung said, hey, what about the collective shadow? What about the collective shadow? And so this was the first time that we're looking at how things like genocide, world wars, racism, xenophobia, these large constructs are fitting within the collective unconscious. And so all of this is mediating what gets seen in the world as a persona. Now, if we look, there's a deeper level to the shadow, which is an echo of Freud's work, the animus and anima. So it's this idea that at the soul level, we're deeply socialized by the parent of the opposite sex. So for an example, in this theory, we would say we potentially look for a partner that's like our father's energy or the masculine energy in our life. And we often behave in a relationship in a way that's like the same sex partner. So this point right here is a deep point of realization for many students, for many clients that I have. And when they go, oh my gosh, I've been dating my father, or I've been sleeping with men that are just like my father, right? So it is a big realization that when we're raised as children, we have these energy grooves, and we often seek out those same grooves as we grow and mature because they're what's comfortable to us. And this can be for better or worse. Now, I also just want to take a moment and name, not everybody in a modern world has the experience of heterosexual parenting or that experience, or maybe you're in a same-sex relationship. And so this is one of the queer critiques of the anima and animus. However, many writers have come to really morph and create more of an expanded identity in the combination of anima and animus. So I really invite you to hold more of the yin-yang perspective here of what type of training lines or parental indoctrination you had. And so all of that is also deep in the shadow work. So I think that in the early 1900s, this is the first time we're seeing how things like sexual trauma can really impact personality. And you can see in this graphic, personality is a pretty big deal. So I have some statistics from RAIN. I really like this website. For many years, I did sexual trauma research and was even in court systems on behalf of children who were displaying behaviors that weren't in alignment and play, and taking that to a court to look at if there's parental sexual assault and incest happening in a child's life. And so I just want to share that Psychodynamic, we have to give a little bow. Thank you for being the first group to really bring this forward. So right now in the US, every 68 seconds, there's a reported case of sexual assault. It's a little over a minute, someone saying, hey, you broke a sexual boundary for me. And we know that 54% of these reports of assault are ages 18 to 34. So it's happening with young to mid adults. We also know that 15% of reported, and echo that, of reported assault cases is 12 years old to 17. So if what gets reported is at 50% or 15 rather, think about how that impacts the rest of the lifespan of that individual. And we'll talk more on the biology of that impact in a moment. But we also know that 28% of folks who've endured sexual assault are 35 to 64. And similar to kind of Freud's bell curve of it, after the genital phase, it kind of mellows out. So then we're at 3% of individuals who are over the age of 65 and older report sexual assault. 1 out of every 6 females or female identifying people have had the experience of sexual assault. 1 in 6. So if you take a look around in your family, in your neighborhood, and you count houses, it's like, oh yeah, that house, every 6 houses in the United States has that experience. So this is a big deal, but it also impacts men and boys. And this is really important to note because this population often gets overlooked for sexual assault. So we know that, especially with college students and young boys, the rate is 1 in roughly 30. Some statistics say 33 male adults have had that experience. So 1 in 30. So I just really want to name that this impacts everybody. And when we look at queer and trans statistics, which aren't provided by RAIN, but we know that those are even higher. So I think that a psychodynamic lens of looking at the unconscious mind and the collective unconscious mind is of absolute utility for us as clinicians, even if you never identify as a psychoanalytic practitioner, which is more Carl Jung style, versus Freud, which is more psychodynamic. Okay, so in Aldwin's book on the biology of stress, there's this really incredible study it referenced that I hadn't heard of before, called Valiant's Hierarchy of Defense Mechanism. So this study was a longitudinal study, and for decades, they followed college men and wanted to know, how does their ego mediate things that feel threatening? And so here's what they found. Like, how cool is this? And this is building off of some of Freud's earlier work with defense mechanism. He talked primarily about transference, countertransference, as well as projection. But this list is way more expansive. So let's take a look. So we can see that the lowest level of trying to defend ourselves when we feel psychologically threatened is denial. So it's like, oh, I spilled milk on the floor. I know I spilled it. That wasn't me. Right? It almost sounds silly to hear. The other one is distortion or projecting it, of like, oh no, I think my dog knocked over the milk and that's why it's everywhere and I just haven't cleaned it yet. But did the dog really knock over the milk? Right? Like, so this is level 1, is completely denying that something happened. Okay, level 2, fantasy. I'm not happy in my coupled or partner relationship. So instead of naming that to my partner or naming it to my therapist, I'm just going to fantasize about how the grass is greener on the other side and about how amazing it would be if I was with someone else. Another one is projection. Projection happens all the time. I think we live in a society of projections because we take our lived experience and then, like a flashlight shining, we expand it out to everything around us, not knowing that the things around us can have a really different perspective. So when we're looking at projection, one way you can think about this is the Hindu myth of the elephant, and everyone's trying to describe God. And so someone touches the trunk of the elephant and they're like, God is long and flowy, right? And someone else touches the foot and they're like, no, God is rounded and heavy. And another person just has access to the tail and they're like, no, God is fuzzy and soft, right? So the point of that is we project from the perspective and the lived experiences we have. So a defense mechanism is to only see something from your way. And then when we look at hypochondriasis, it's really just a nervous. I'm going to get so nervous that I'll look away from something. We also have passive aggressive behavior. This one is really common with trauma, and we'll talk about trauma-informed care kind of throughout the class. But it's turning the hate inward and imploding instead of exploding as a defense mechanism. So let's say you did bad on a test, and your instructor only told you that the test was a pop quiz, you didn't know was coming. Maybe you didn't sleep well. You had to work extra hours at work that you didn't plan for. And instead of compassion for yourself, of like, oh, I did the best I could, that was really hard, you're like, oh, I am a piece of dust. I'm nothing. I'm so bad at life. I'm such a bad student, right? So that is also an immature way to defend yourself from just mistakes happen. That reality is hard for us. The nature of the world is chaos. So we turn against ourselves instead of deal with the truth of, hey, the nature of reality is chaos happens. So level 2. Level 3 are more neurotic mechanisms. And those are things like intellectualizing. And guess what, y'all, as students, you got to watch out for that one. Don't intellectualize things. Also fill them with your heart. Repression, reaction formation, displacement, and disassociation. We're going to go into unpacking all of those as we go. But for level 3, you can see that they're a little bit more advanced than denial, right? You're not just looking away and denying what happened, but intellectualizing, oh, the milk spilt, and it's because I left it too close on the edge of the table. And you're intellectualizing how it fell, but maybe it's just because you were rushing because you're feeling anxious and trying to get out the door. And so you're intellectualizing how it fell, but you're not connecting with how it feels that it broke or a mess was made. So these are level 3. And then when we look at level 4, we're looking at things like sublimation, altruism, suppression, anticipation, and humor. Sublimation is one's ability to channel raw energy, raw id energy, impulse into something productive. So let's say you grew up in a family where you were beaten a lot by older brothers against your will, and you kind of like really had to tough up. If someone was upset, they punched you. If someone was happy, they punched you. So all of a sudden you grow into being an adult, and that's your way of being in the world, is being very physical. So to deal with, per se, let's say anger, instead of going around and punching someone at a party because you're upset, maybe you join a boxing gym and you use that raw energy to a healthy channel. So that would be the more advanced way to channel when we feel threatened at an ego level. Another way is altruism, right? Putting yourself in someone else's shoes, where we say, oh, I know what it feels like when I haven't slept well, and it's really painful and hard, and I make mistakes like typos. You know what? The next time I read a typo, I'm not going to judge the person. I'm going to send them some restful energy. May things slow down, right? Or, you know what? I'm going to bring some food to the homeless. I know what it's like to be hungry. It feels terrible. So I know I didn't define each of these, but we're going to do that in groups. And I've also given you really nice handouts that define some of these kind of more basic aspects that we see throughout the lifespan when we're feeling like we have something to defend. I also just want to name here, I brought in curanderismo, as we're talking about different ways of being. So just to remind ourselves, we're still couching ourselves in Western psychology as we're talking about Freud, but there are different ways in different cultures to work with that defense mechanism that involves setting up energetic boundaries or praying to the heavens, or using spirituality as a way to protect that which feels unsafe. So just want to name, we covered Western defense mechanisms, but there's so much more out there. So just thinking of all of that. So I just wanted to give you the study that I referenced, Valent, Bond, and Valent, which is looking at how these occur over a lifetime. And they did a perspective follow-up of 40 years. That's some dedication. Y'all, I do research. I can't imagine going back and working on one study for 40 years. That's a big deal. So just wanted to share this with you if you have an interest to read more. So as I mentioned, in your sheet, I have these all filled out for you with some examples. You'll be filling these out, but let's just take a moment to read through them. Acting out, often a conflict between an unconscious need to express anger and also wanting to deny it. Like, I don't want to be upset, but I really am upset. And so I act out in another way. Avoidance, staying away from a situation, a person, a place, a thing that can make me have to deal with really hard feelings that maybe I'm not ready to. Denial, refusal to believe that death happens, right? I don't want to believe that we all die. It's hard, so I'll just pretend it doesn't happen. Displacement, this one's really common. So often displacing anger onto a situation or a person that feels less threatening. So maybe I'm pissed at my boss, and so instead I take it out at someone who's in the drive-thru by scoffing at them or giving them a dirty look or feeling like they're not doing a good job because I'm upset with something else. So I displace the energy here. Next one is disassociation. So emotional conflict becomes so intense that you check out, where it's like, sorry, what did you say? I was somewhere else. Or someone maybe starts bringing up finances or debt, and all of a sudden they're talking and you're no longer listening to what they're saying. Maybe you're just watching their mouth move. And then all of a sudden it starts to sound like someone from The Simpsons is talking. Yeah, so all of this is part of it. Identification. So identification is something really common among adolescents where it's just wanting to be in another person's group, inner group, so you can be liked. So if everybody in your senior class is like, I love pizza, let's have a pizza party, and you're actually like, I'm lactose intolerant, but you decide to eat the pizza anyways because everyone else likes it. Identification. So those were just some examples. I have plenty more in the handouts for you. Are you excited? Because I am. I'm so excited for you to be thinking about these psychosexual stages as the first time we're looking at psychotherapy addressing sexual trauma, even though it was formed by white European men who probably didn't have the best handle on types of abuse and invite females to come in and be part of those conversations. We'll speed up a few decades. So thinking about the psychosexual stages, thinking about defense mechanisms. So I just wanted to kind of end this section with psychosexual stages represent a fixation of libido. And libido is sex drive and instinct. And this can happen at different areas of the body. And so we grow thinking that some areas of the body are really important and others aren't. And these are often us navigating pleasure or painful experience. And so that's just on page 32 from the text. Okay, so let's just take a pause. We've talked about Freud, we've talked about Carl Jung, and we know that they had a falling out because Jung had less of an emphasis on sexuality, Freud had more of one. We've talked about two constructs of mind maps, and we've talked about ego defense mechanisms, as well as, what am I missing? You got it. We're missing developmental stages. So Erik Erikson comes along, he's part of these scholarly circles and is curious, like, this is interesting. This is the first time we're mapping out stages that humans go through across the lifespan. How cool, right? That there's a season to things. So I'm going to give you a moment to just kind of review this and be thinking in your head, how is this different or similar to what Freud thought? So the graphic that I've chosen comes from Very Well. I really like this website. It's a really nice little summary of any theories if you ever have questions or want to do a recap. But this is the first time that we're seeing psychoanalysis as laid out by Freud get to expand beyond things beyond the psychosexual development. So we see in Erik Erikson's work that there's a theme of trust or mistrust. Are you going to get food? Can you feel safe in your environment? We also see the early stages of shame and autonomy, like, can I hold my bowels if I need to go to the bathroom, or do I have an accident at preschool and having to navigate a little bit of shame or potentially doubt. And so that kind of comes up with the preschool years, which are 3 to 5, where a kiddo is definitely navigating what is their purpose? Am I a good kid? Am I a bad kid? And then we go to the school age, which is industry. And so, but as we're kind of moving along, I just can't help but notice, is there a system or even a color system that you're seeing and curious about? I'll try not to give it away, but if we look at Hinduism, look at the chakras. And that's really what I see when I look at Erik Erikson's model is we have trust and interest, which is like the root, right? And then early anatomy is about creativity, even sexuality. Um, and we have preschool, which is building your confidence. Am I good or bad? That's like, the solar plexus chakra color yellow. And then the heart as we get to school age. So I'm not saying he stole anything, but I'm just saying how cool that advanced cultures who have been here well before Western psychology kind of mapped this out for us already. And so what's great if you do a deeper overview of Erikson's work is each area has a question with it. For example, in the preschool stage, the question might be, am I good or bad? And the basic virtue is purpose. And important events are things like play. If we're looking at industry and inferiority, some of the questions are, am I competent? And important events are really centered around scholastic life. And when we're looking at things like industry, it's really just about learning new skills and not feeling like they're worthless or inferior compared to their classmates. So the big question in the adolescent period is like, who am I, right? Am I goth? Do I like other females? Do I have more of a heterosexual orientation? Who am I? So that's kind of the major question, but the basic virtue is fidelity. Are you being true to yourself? And social relationships become really important in this stage. In stage 6, we have intimacy and isolation, which is love. Will I be loved? Will I be alone? And those are big questions as we get to intimacy and adulthood. And then as we get to middlehood, it's really this conundrum of stagnation, right? Maybe you had the job you've been working for and you have kids. And so there is this having a check-in kind of from age 40 to 65 of a virtue around care. How can I contribute to the world? What legacy am I going to live? And then that takes us into maturity, which is all about kind of processing death. Am I okay with the legacy that I'm leaving? So the theme in this one is really about legacy. And this is 65 to end of life, according to Erik Erikson. And his question that he poses here is, did I achieve a meaningful life? So our textbook, you can read more about these if you want. You can definitely go and read online, but you will need to know Erik Erikson as a key theorist relating to psychoanalysis. And these models, I hope you will take some time to really digest them, because when you work with clients, they're integral. Because what happens is if we experience a traumatic event at any one of these arcs or stages in the life course, we often have to go back and repeat it. I know. So let's say you had the experience in high school of being made fun of and you were bullied. Maybe you were so preoccupied with trying to survive that you didn't get to ask the question of, who am I? And so perhaps your defense mechanism was being like everybody else, trying to fit in. And so in that trying to fit in, you didn't have a chance to explore, wait a second, I might be gay. Or wait a second, I don't know if I have the same religious orientation as my family. And so Carl Jung said that we have to individuate. We have to become our own sense of self in truth and alignment, despite our socialization, despite the arc of conditioning that we receive. And so each one of these segments becomes a way to check in with a client. Hey, do you have a sense of trust in your life, of basic needs? You will have food. You will have roof over your head. Or is that an issue or a contention? So then we have to go back and do some inner child work. And when we look at modalities like IFS, internal family systems, or hypnosis, or eye movement desensitization reprogramming, EMDR, they're really all coming from this origin story of psychodynamic, looking below the surface at what place in the lifespan did we not get a need met? and then going back and meeting that need. So take a look at Erikson's model, take a look at Freud's model for these developmental courses, and then think about the two maps of the mind. Okay, so as we're talking about going back and repeating things and experiences that we didn't get to have because something was clipped, comes in sexual trauma again, because we know that 1 in 6 females have had this experience, and 1 in roughly 30 men, and even higher for queer populations, up to like 50% of queer identifying people have had that experience. So Freud became really convinced that a lot of the neurotic problems were rooted in trauma and infancy. And he was told by many of his female patients that their fathers were assaulting them. And so Summit had this theory that was proposed in 1983 called child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, that suggested that we actually deny cognitively, psychologically, that the experience even happened, and we don't remember it because we get so advanced at repression that we don't know what happens, but it's going to keep making us sick via nervous system responses like sweating or night sweats or anxiety or panic. Other symptoms can be nightmares that we can't place, or just not feeling safe in the world, or needing high levels of control. So children often deny that sexual abuse happened as a defense mechanism. So there was a study done, and forgive me, I'm forgetting the study because I read a lot. I like to read at least one study a week on a Sunday morning when I can. And so there was a study I read of, they had children who were molested on tape. And they asked the children, they had it on tape that this had taken place. And did this individual harm you or molest you or cause you pain? And in all cases, the children said no. And what they remembered was the salient memory of receiving candy and the person being nice to them. What they couldn't recall was the sexual abuse. And so in part, the sexual accommodation syndrome could be, on one hand, that they don't have the cognitive schema developed yet to be able to verbally produce words of, that was inappropriate touch, or that was painful. They don't have words that could be a piece of it cognitively. The second piece is that it's so intense for their system, they default to denial, repression. But then, as we know from Carl Jung's work, the anima and animus, often sexual adults or sexual survivors of childhood trauma, they seek out partners like their parents. So often you'll find that a survivor is like, why am I always caught up in a really difficult relationship? And it's because of these unconscious patterns. So one of the diagnoses that we see a lot with early childhood sexual trauma is that we'll have things like flashbacks, nightmares that wake you up in a fright, thinking about traumatic things when you're not trying to, and sometimes feeling triggered in a way that can leave you shaky or overwhelmed. And what a hard experience to have if you can't remember cognitively why you're feeling that way. That's very challenging. And so again, some of our defense mechanisms can be to avoid, so we can isolate ourselves or rely on alcohol or food to avoid feeling that pain. And also perfectionism. I know in our society kind of rewards that in many ways, of like, oh, you're overworking, that's great, we'll pay you more, give you more money. Or, oh, you look like you have things perfect or together, when really perfectionism and being highly critical are avoidance symptoms. You don't have to feel what's messy on the inside. We also can see symptoms like affect regulation, which is crying uncontrollably, feeling panicky, or feeling really numb to your emotions, as well as other things, negative self-concept and disassociation. If you want to read more about some of those things I'm alluding to, complex PTSD, that's a diagnosis in the DSM, which we're talk about the DSM. Ooh, I got a lot to say about that, but we'll get there. Okay, so as promised, we'll talk a little bit about how when we have a mismatch of early childhood trauma, whether it is sexual or whether it's just violence or a lack of resources, this puts the nervous system in a state of cortisol. And so I invite you to learn this and teach it to everybody you know. I know you're like, mailman, mail person, let me tell you about the brain. So in the most basic way we can think about it, see your thumb and then cross it over with your pointer fingers. So right here, this is the reptilian brain, which is kind of the instinct, fight, fright, eat, protect self. So reptiles will even eat their own eggs. Can you imagine having a baby and all that work and then just being like, actually, I'm a little hungry, right? So reptiles, fierce, survival. Next, limbic system. So we're thinking more of like the elephant, really tending to your lung. When one member of an elephant family passes, all of the elephants from other tribes come and gather. And they know based on the vibration of their feet. So they speak with their feet. So elephants, very emotionally inclined, mammalian brain. Put that on top. Here's the human brain, neocortex, speech, logic, higher thinking, the ability to sense into morality, neocortex. So what happens though is when we have a disruption really early in life, it turns on this reptilian brain and then we're constantly pumping cortisol into the system. That's really hard. So I want you to take a moment, and if you feel inclined, just draw this out in your notes because it's a great reference for when you're explaining the biology of stress and what can happen in the body in a very tangible, a very tactile way. So this model came about in the 1960s from an individual named Paul MacLean. And it's basically the idea that the evolution of the midbrain into a neocortex into the gray matter actually is what allows humans higher thinking. But when we're in a traumatic state, we automatically pull into our small thinking, reptilian brain. I don't have enough. I'm not safe. Cortisol dumps. Instead of being able to live and move and breathe in our limbic system. So explaining to people, hey, I can help you with some activities, some tools that will take us from our reptile brain into how we feel. And then in that feeling, we can process, we can get together and deconstruct why you feel like you're not enough. Or maybe we can deconstruct the phrase, men are dangerous or men are hard, or females just use you for your money, or gayness is bad, or it's evil, right? We can take a cognitive thought form and look around it, cognitive diffusion, without attaching to it. But we only have that capacity if we're in the neocortex. If our brain is in a reptilian brain, fight, freeze, beer, right? Whatever it is, then we can't access these higher ways of thinking. And so if you had some time to also read through early precursors of understanding the mind, Music in his book talks about that it's really important what happens in those first years of life, especially if we look at oxytocin. So being by someone who loves us and cares for us increases the amount of oxytocin juice that we're literally producing in our body. And so what we see is that there are sophisticated skills that happen by infants who are only 6 months that can sense that. And so they've done studies, particularly Dones in 2007, found that eye contact And touch leads to more oxytocin in the body. So if you didn't get that experience as a kiddo, then you don't have the same pathways as some people to be able to produce that connection hormone that allows to have positive feelings. We also can see research studies that look at how this changes across the world, these early life experiences. For example, in the West, babies are diagnosed with colic or crying because they're unable to be soothed. But in other countries, they won't actually let the baby rest without being touched. So you can imagine how your brain, how your physiology, how your nervous system is going to develop very differently if you've been held by your whole community and passed around for ages versus if you had more of a Western lens where it's like, no, we're going to teach our baby to cry. Or, you know, we just don't have enough food and mom is working or dad is working 10 hours a week, I wish, 10 hours a day. Maybe that baby's not getting held as much. So all of this plays into how we grow and really our preferences around personality. In the most basic way, we can think about this as fight or flight, which is what part of the brain? Yep, the reptilian. And it's going to prepare the body for intense physical activity, like I'm going to run, I'm going to overwork, I'm going to think really hard, instead of the rest and digest of, I have everything I need. I'm going to just rest. I'm going to be. I'm going to breathe. I'm going to enjoy meditating. So all of this early childhood experiences absolutely shapes the body. This is one of my favorite studies looking at adverse childhood experiences, where they asked just under 20,000 people in the US, so a really nice sample size here, how their life was before the age of 18 related to physical abuse, emotional, sexual, and just also household function and or dysfunction and neglect. And what you see is that these numbers are really high. When we look at sexual assault in females, nearly 25% say, yeah, I had that experience. When we look at just household dysfunction of someone in my home had a mental illness, maybe schizophrenia or alcoholism, people are like, oh yeah, 30% of people in the US are saying, yeah, that's part of my experience. And then also when we look at neglect. So as we're going through all of this, we're thinking, oh my gosh, there's so much compassion needed for the lived experience of the clients who are coming to you, asking you to help them regulate their nervous system. And you have to remember, you have 12 cranial nerves, which we're going to go over in our attachment lecture, as well as unpack the different parts of the brain. So it's not just your simple triune brain, which is reptilian, mammal, neocortex. That's just for simple purposes, simplicity. But we're going to really look at, okay, well, what are the 12 cranial nerves that get impacted with these early childhood experiences? And what mindfulness tools related to how we attach and bond can help us rewrite this biological story in our body. So I hope you'll check out this study. It's in your readings. And I also included London's work on sexual accommodation theory for you. Okay, so I know it was a little over an hour. I hope you paused me if you needed a break or so. Sorry, I have textbooks in my laps, in the lap. So here's what we went over today. Developmental stages. So we looked at Freud's developmental stage as well, like Erik Erikson's, talking about the themes. We also talked about all of the ego defense mechanisms. So I really invite you to start to notice which ones you have. And maybe they're healthy ones like altruism, like, hey, I like to do something nice for someone else when I'm having a bad day. Or maybe it's, you know, when I get emotionally dysregulated, I go for a long run and then I feel really strong and invigorated after. Or maybe there's some places in your life where you disassociate or you deny or you project. And that's all okay, right? That cognitive diffusion, we're not needing to fix or change. We're just noticing in ourselves. So that's how we're using the ego defense mechanisms. And then we also talked about personality structure. structures, right? So knowing that the iceberg is very Freudian, knowing that the collective unconscious and that mind map is very Jungian. If you like Carl Jung, like I do, I teach a whole course on it in the fall or in the spring. So please tune back in. I love a lot of this theories of anima and animus, of how we can date our parents, we can unpack all of that. And then, of course, we talked about the biology of stress and how psychodynamic theory is actually quite useful in working with clients now as we look at what's in the unconscious mind. Because so many of the therapies that come forward, like cognitive and behavioral therapy, or just, first wave behaviors on like Pavlov and Skinner, they don't really talk about what's underneath the iceberg. And so for a few decades, that kind of goes dormant a little bit in psychological research, unless you're, part of a psychoanalytic community. So we'll talk more on attachment work next week. And so that will be some of the reading. There's some really great cross-cultural resources and studies in Grams and Music book. So please check that out. And that's all I have for you now. I hope that you can walk away with these kind of 3 nuggets of developmental stages, ego defense mechanisms, personality structure, and how they're wrapped in the biology of our environment. And with that, I hope that you enjoy the activity of getting to look at defense mechanisms with characters in films. So just take a moment and I invite you to digest that, right? Not just in your mind, but notice the amylase and protease in the mouth. That's a chemical breakdown we have for food, but also information. Notice if your saliva feels a little dry, or notice if you feel like you have a lot of excess saliva. And then I invite you to swallow. And as you swallow, just kind of visualizing the esophagus, visualizing the larynx and the pharynx, the voice box. And once you notice that esophagus, track it down, 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 all the way to the belly, the stomach and the spleen. So in Taoism, we don't just digest food in the mind, right? That would make it very top heavy. We also digest it in the stomach. So I want you to just perhaps take 2 more breath cycles, just honoring the digestion of these 3 important nuggets that are wrapped into the human biology. May your learning and integration be for the good of self and the good of all beings. May all beings know they're free. May you feel grounded and may you feel expansive. With that, we'll bring our lecture to a conclusion.